Today, we're zeroing in on one of the most brutal and, frankly, tragic chapters in U.S. military history. We're not talking about the entire Vietnam War here, but one single six-week operation back in 1971. An operation that became the single bloodiest helicopter battle America has ever seen, and one that would completely change military aviation forever. So let's just start with a number: 108. That is how many American helicopters were completely destroyed by enemy fire during this one operation. And get this, that number doesn't even include helicopters lost to accidents or mechanical failures. This was 108 aircraft shot directly out of the sky. And, if you can believe it, on top of that, more than 600 others were damaged, a lot of them so badly they never flew again. You know, to even begin to grasp what that felt like, you have to hear it from the pilots who lived through it. One of them described it simply as flying into a wall of lead. And that just perfectly captures the kind of pure terror they were facing. The second they crossed the border into Laos, it wasn't just sporadic fire. No, they were flying head-on into a coordinated, impenetrable curtain of anti-aircraft fire that had one single purpose: to tear them out of the sky.
So that brings us to the big question, right? How did this happen? How did a single operation that was supposed to be this huge, decisive victory just spiral into the costliest, deadliest helicopter battle the U.S. military has ever experienced? Well, let's break it down. To really get the scale of this disaster, you first got to understand why the helicopter became the absolute icon of the war in Vietnam. It wasn't just a machine, it was the entire American strategy.
I mean, think about the terrain in Vietnam for a second. You've got these incredibly dense jungles, rugged mountains, and basically no real road system. For a traditional army with tanks and trucks, it's a nightmare. You're just completely bogged down. But the helicopter? It changed everything. This whole new concept called air mobility meant you could leapfrog all of that. You could drop an entire company of soldiers right on top of an objective, keep them supplied, and pull them out in just a few minutes. It was an absolute game changer.
And the U.S. went all in on this idea, creating the famous air cavalry. At its heart was the UH-1 Huey, the absolute workhorse of the war. It did everything: troop transport, medevac, you name it. To protect the Hueys, they brought in the AH-1 Cobra, a sleek, purpose-built attack helicopter, a real hunter-killer. And for the heavy stuff, you had the massive Chinooks, which could literally drop huge artillery guns into a remote jungle clearing like it was nothing.
But here's the thing. The North Vietnamese army, they were watching, they were learning, and they were adapting. They knew their absolute lifeline was the Ho Chi Minh Trail, this complex network of paths that snaked through Laos and Cambodia. And they knew, sooner or later, the Americans would try to use their helicopters to cut it. So, they decided to turn that lifeline into an impenetrable fortress.
And this just gives you a sense of the terrifying scale of what they built. We are not talking about a few guys with rifles here. This was a massive, integrated air defense network, all hidden under that thick triple canopy jungle. We're talking heavy machine guns, rapid-fire anti-aircraft cannons, all perfectly camouflaged and already aimed at the spots where helicopters would most likely fly or try to land. Their tactic was as simple as it was brutal. Wait for the helicopters to come in low and slow for a landing, and then just unleash hell from every direction at once.
And this is what brings us to the operation itself, Lam Son 719. The stage was perfectly set. You had the unstoppable force of American air mobility about to fly straight into the immovable object of the Ho Chi Minh Trail's defenses. Now, to understand why this operation even happened, you have to look at the politics back home. By 1971, President Nixon was all about Vietnamization. It was his big strategy for pulling American ground troops out of the war and handing the fighting over to the South Vietnamese Army, or the ARVN. Lam Son 719 was basically designed to be their final exam, a massive offensive to prove to the entire world that they could stand on their own and win. And right here, this is the fatal flaw at the very heart of the entire plan. So the idea was the ARVN would be the boots on the ground. U.S. helicopters would provide, well, everything else: transport, supplies, gunship support, medevac. But, and this is the absolute key, a law had just been passed by Congress that forbade any U.S. ground troops from setting foot in Laos. So what did that mean? It meant American pilots and their crews were going to be flying into this fortress completely alone, with no American infantry to help secure their landing zones. They were totally exposed. The whole operation basically unraveled in 3 disastrous phases. First, the initial insertion was met with a storm of anti-aircraft fire that shocked even the most experienced pilots. Then, the ARVN's ground advance just stalled almost immediately because every single landing zone had been turned into a death trap. And finally, what was supposed to be a triumphant push just devolved into a desperate, chaotic retreat, where those helicopters became the only way out and the NVA's #1 target.
This pilot's description just says it all. Streams of light. The NVA gunners weren't just shooting randomly. They were firing in these coordinated barrages, creating what looked like a literal web of tracer rounds in the sky. It wasn't about trying to hit one helicopter. It was about saturating the entire sky with so much steel that it was almost impossible for anything to fly through and survive.
The aftermath was a complete catastrophe, but out of it came some of the hardest learned lessons in modern military history, lessons that were paid for with the lives of American aircrews.
This visual really puts it all into perspective. Just look at that. No other single battle in the entire war, or in U.S. history for that matter, even comes close to the 108 helicopters shot down during Lamsan 719. It was a level of loss in such a short period of time that was just completely unprecedented.
And for the crews that actually made it to the ground, even for just a few seconds, it was hell on earth. This quote from a medevac crew chief, it's not an exaggeration. Can you just imagine a volume of fire so intense that it's literally shredding the jumble around you, making the ground itself look like it's dancing from thousands and thousands of bullet impacts? That's what they were flying into.
And that brings us to the medevac crews. Pretty much everyone agrees they had the most dangerous job in the sky. They flew unarmed Hueys marked with a big red cross straight into the heart of the firefight. And the NVA knew this. They adopted a brutal but incredibly effective tactic. They would often wait to open fire until the medevac bird was coming in to land, and then target it specifically. They knew if they could take out the dust-off helicopter, it would crush the morale of the soldiers on the ground.
So, why did it all go so catastrophically wrong? Well, it wasn't just one thing, it was a complete cascade of errors, a perfect storm of failure. You had a fatal strategic error, sending helicopters in without their own ground support. You had a massive intelligence failure, drastically underestimating just how many anti-aircraft guns the enemy had waiting for them. And finally, you had tactical failures, with some RVN commanders hesitating, which forced the helicopters to just hover over these hot landing zones, making them sitting ducks.
The consequences were immediate and they were huge. For the Nixon administration, it was a public relations nightmare, with pictures of burning American helicopters being broadcast all over the world. For the North Vietnamese, it was an incredible morale boost. But really, the most lasting impact was on the U.S. military itself. Lamsan 719 was a brutal wake-up call that forced them to completely rewrite the book on aviation doctrine. The lesson was crystal clear. Helicopters cannot survive alone against a modern, prepared air defense system.
And you know what? That legacy is still flying with us today. The painful lessons learned in the skies over Laos directly influenced the design of the next generation of American military aircraft. The heavy emphasis on survivability, on armor, on advanced weapons systems that you see on the AH-64 Apache and the UH-60 Blackhawk, that was born directly from the fire and the loss of Lamsan 719.
And that really leaves us with a final, lingering thought. Lamsan 719 was a brutal lesson where superior American technology was completely overwhelmed by superior North Vietnamese preparation and strategy. It's a stark reminder that even the most advanced weapons in the world can be broken if they're used in the wrong way. And that raises a timeless question that we're still grappling with in conflicts all over the world today.